What happens when a carefully planned celebrity interview takes an unexpected turn on live television? Not because of shouting or chaos, but because of a single question that shifts the tone in the room. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Live television has a way of revealing what rehearsed appearances try to conceal. There are no edits, no retakes, no protection from the subtle shifts in expression that millions of viewers can see in real time. And when Margot Robbie appeared on The View during a promotional tour, what unfolded was not a loud confrontation, but something quieter, more revealing, and far more memorable for those watching closely. The View has long been known for its conversational style that can, at times, become unexpectedly probing. The hosts often balance warmth with pointed questions, especially when a guest's public image, recent roles, or statements intersect with cultural conversations happening beyond Hollywood. Sunny Hostin, in particular, is known for asking questions that connect entertainment to broader social themes. Her approach is thoughtful, direct, and often layered with legal and ethical framing drawn from her background as a former federal prosecutor. Margot Robbie, on the other hand, has built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most composed and media-savvy actors. Whether promoting films like I, Tonya, Bombshell, or Barbie, she presents herself with calm charm and professional grace. Interviews with her are typically light, energetic, and focused on her work, her preparation for roles, and her production company's efforts to bring female-driven stories to the screen. She rarely appears rattled. She rarely looks surprised. That is what made this particular exchange stand out. The studio that day carried its usual rhythm. The audience was warm, the music upbeat, and the conversation began the way most celebrity segments do: friendly, enthusiastic, and celebratory. The hosts welcomed Robbie with admiration, referencing her recent projects and her influence in the industry as both an actor and producer. She smiled easily, laughed, and responded with the practiced ease of someone who has done dozens of talk show appearances across continents. At first, the questions followed a familiar path. Preparation for roles. The challenge of portraying real women in history. The responsibility she feels when stepping into stories that resonate beyond entertainment. Robbie answered with clarity and thoughtfulness, often emphasizing teamwork and the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Nothing felt out of place. But live interviews are unpredictable not because someone intends conflict, but because conversation can naturally move into deeper territory without warning. As the discussion turned toward the themes present in her recent work, particularly stories centered on power, public perception, and women navigating difficult environments, the tone subtly shifted. Sunny Hostin leaned into the conversation with the kind of question that does not attack, but reframes. It wasn't phrased dramatically. It wasn't hostile, but it required more than a promotional answer. She asked Robbie about the responsibility actors and producers carry when telling stories that are tied to real social issues, and whether Hollywood sometimes benefits from dramatizing those issues without fully engaging with the real-world implications. It was a question that connected entertainment to accountability, and it required a thoughtful, careful response. For a brief moment, Robbie paused. It was the kind of pause that live television captures perfectly. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, but noticeably longer than the rhythm of the earlier exchange. A moment where the smile softened, the posture straightened, and the answer required a different level of focus. Viewers at home may not have noticed anything dramatic, but those who watch interviews closely could see the shift. This was no longer about the excitement of a film release. It was about the meaning behind the stories being told. Robbie responded with composure, acknowledging the weight of the question. She spoke about the intention behind her production company, about choosing projects that amplify voices and experiences that deserve attention. She emphasized the importance of research, collaboration, and listening to the people whose stories are being represented. Her answer was sincere, careful, and measured. And yet, the exchange had clearly changed the energy of the segment. The rest of the panel listened intently. The studio audience, typically quick to laugh or applaud, was noticeably quieter during this part of the conversation. There was a seriousness in the air that hadn't been present at the start. What had begun as a standard promotional visit had turned into something closer to a thoughtful discussion about art, influence, and responsibility. This is what makes live television powerful. No one raised their voice. No one interrupted, but a single well-placed question shifted the conversation from light entertainment to something more reflective. Sunny Hostin followed up gently, allowing Robbie space to elaborate rather than pressing aggressively. The exchange remained respectful, professional, and calm. But the tension was there, not negative tension, but intellectual tension. The kind that comes when a guest is asked to go beyond rehearsed talking points. Robbie handled it with grace, but viewers could sense that this was not the interview she had expected when she walked onto the stage. As the conversation moved forward, the tone gradually returned to lighter topics. There were smiles again, shared laughter, and discussion about future projects. But the moment had already happened. It lingered quietly in the background, shaping the rest of the segment in subtle ways. Because once a conversation shifts into deeper territory on live television, it doesn't simply reset. Everyone in the room is aware of it. By the time the segment ended, nothing dramatic had occurred. There were no headlines about conflict, no viral clips of raised voices. Yet for many viewers, this appearance stood out from countless other celebrity interviews for one simple reason. It felt real. It felt unscripted. It felt like two professionals navigating a serious topic in real time, without preparation, without edits, and without the safety net that usually protects promotional appearances. And that is exactly why this moment mattered. Because sometimes, the most revealing live TV exchanges are not the loud confrontations, but the quiet questions that require honest answers. What happened next, and how this brief exchange subtly shaped the public perception of the interview, is where the story becomes even more interesting. Before Margot Robbie ever walked onto the set of The View that morning, the context surrounding her career had already begun to evolve in a way that made interviews more layered than they had been in earlier years. She was no longer just a rising star known for breakout performances. By this point, she had become a producer with real influence in Hollywood through her company, Lucky Chap Entertainment. The projects attached to her name were not random. They were carefully selected, often centered on complex female narratives, real historical figures, and stories that touched on power, reputation, and public scrutiny. Films like I, Tonya, and Bombshell had placed her at the center of conversations about how media treats women, how stories are framed, and how public perception can be shaped by powerful institutions. These were not light subjects. They were deeply connected to real-world issues that audiences and journalists were actively discussing beyond movie theaters. At the same time, Robbie's public image remained consistently warm, professional, and media-friendly. She rarely stepped into controversy. She did not make inflammatory statements. She avoided political commentary in interviews and focused primarily on craft, storytelling, and collaboration. This made her a favorite guest for talk shows, where she was seen as articulate, charismatic, and easy to engage. But that also meant something important. The more carefully a public figure manages their narrative, the more noticeable it becomes when a conversation drifts outside that familiar frame. In the weeks leading up to her appearance on The View, Robbie had been doing a series of interviews to promote her latest project. Most of them followed a predictable pattern. Questions about preparation. Questions about working with co-stars. Questions about the cultural impact of the film. She answered all of them with the same calm clarity she was known for. Yet across media platforms, a broader discussion was quietly taking shape around Hollywood's tendency to tell stories about serious social issues while still operating within an entertainment-driven system. Journalists, critics, and commentators were increasingly asking whether films that portray real struggles also carry a responsibility to engage with those struggles beyond the screen. This was not a criticism aimed directly at Robbie, but it was part of the environment in which she was promoting her work. And The View, with its blend of entertainment and social commentary, was uniquely positioned to bridge that gap in conversation. Sunny Hostin, in particular, had a pattern of guiding interviews toward the intersection of culture and accountability. Her legal background often influenced the way she framed questions. She was less interested in surface-level promotion and more interested in what a project represented in a larger context. That approach had caught guests off guard before. Not because it was aggressive, but because it required a different kind of answer than the ones prepared for typical press tours. Behind the scenes, there is always preparation before a celebrity appears on a live talk show. Publicists coordinate topics. Producers outline general areas of discussion. Guests are briefed on the flow of the segment. But live television does not allow for complete scripting, especially on a show built around spontaneous panel discussion. Robbie likely expected thoughtful questions. She likely expected praise for her work. What she may not have expected was how directly the conversation would connect her roles and production choices to broader ethical questions about storytelling and responsibility. This is where the emotional pressure of the segment began to build before it even started. Because when a guest knows they are appearing on a program that does not shy away from deeper topics, there is an awareness that the conversation could move in unpredictable directions. It's a subtle tension, invisible to viewers, but very present for the person sitting in the chair. In earlier interviews on other platforms, Robbie had been able to guide conversations back toward filmmaking craft whenever topics became too heavy. She had mastered the art of pivoting gracefully. But the View's format, multiple hosts, live audience, unscripted flow, makes that kind of control much harder to maintain. At the same time, the cultural moment made the discussion almost inevitable. Audiences were increasingly aware of how films shape public opinion. Stories based on real events were being scrutinized for accuracy, sensitivity, and intent. Actors who stepped into these roles were being asked not just about performance, but about purpose. Robbie's career choices placed her right at the center of that conversation, whether she intended to be or not. All of this created a quiet sense of anticipation around her appearance. Not from a place of conflict, but from a place of curiosity. How would someone known for careful, polished interviews respond if the discussion moved beyond promotion into reflection? The producers of The View understand this dynamic well. They know that the most memorable moments on live television often come not from confrontation, but from questions that guests did not fully prepare for because they seem simple on the surface. A question about responsibility. A question about influence. A question about the real-world impact of storytelling. These are not hostile questions, but they are difficult to answer in a way that feels authentic without becoming overly cautious. By the time Robbie took her seat on the stage, smiling and relaxed, none of this tension was visible. The audience saw a movie star ready to talk about her latest project. The hosts greeted her warmly. The energy was friendly and upbeat. But beneath that surface, the ingredients for a more serious exchange were already in place. A guest whose recent work touched on sensitive cultural topics. A host known for connecting entertainment to ethics. A live format where pauses cannot be edited and answers cannot be rephrased. And a growing public conversation about the responsibility of Hollywood storytelling. As the early part of the interview unfolded smoothly, this context remained invisible to viewers. Yet it shaped every word that followed. Each question gently nudged the conversation closer to territory that required more than rehearsed anecdotes. Robbie's early answers were confident and engaging. She spoke about the joy of collaboration, the challenge of complex roles, and the excitement of seeing audiences respond to meaningful stories. Everything felt exactly as expected. But with each passing minute, the space for a deeper question was narrowing. Sunny Hostin listened carefully, waiting for the right moment. Not to challenge, but to connect the dots between what Robbie was describing and the larger conversation happening outside the studio. And when that moment arrived, the interview shifted in a way that no one in the audience could have predicted at the start. The groundwork had been laid quietly, patiently, through context, timing, and tone. What happened next did not feel like a confrontation in the traditional sense. It felt like a conversation crossing an invisible line. The conversation had been moving at a comfortable pace, the kind that allows a guest to settle into familiar rhythms. Margot Robbie had smiled through stories about filming, laughed with the hosts about long production days, and described the creative satisfaction of bringing meaningful characters to life. The studio lights were bright, the audience attentive, and the atmosphere felt steady. Then Sunny Hostin leaned slightly forward in her chair. There was no interruption, no sudden change in volume. But the shift was visible in her posture. She waited for a natural pause in Robbie's sentence before speaking, her tone calm and measured. She referenced the themes Robbie had just described. Stories about women navigating powerful institutions, stories about reputation, public judgment, and media influence. Then she asked a question that, on its surface, sounded simple. She asked whether Hollywood sometimes benefits from telling stories about real social struggles while remaining safely removed from those struggles once the cameras stop rolling. And she asked how Robbie, as both an actor and producer, thinks about that responsibility when choosing which stories to tell. The words were not accusatory. They were deliberate, thoughtful, and quietly precise. For a fraction of a second, Robbie's expression did not change. Then came a pause. It was not long enough to be uncomfortable, but long enough to be noticeable. Her smile softened. Her eyes shifted slightly downward, as if organizing her thoughts before responding. Her hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, moved together as she leaned forward a little in her seat. Live television magnifies moments like this. There is no cutaway shot, no editing to shorten silence. Millions of viewers witnessed the exact space between question and answer. The audience in the studio, which had been quick to react earlier with laughter and applause, grew quiet. The energy in the room tightened, not with hostility, but with attention. Everyone was listening more carefully now. Robbie began her answer slowly. She acknowledged that the question was important. She spoke about the intention behind the projects she chooses, explaining that she and her team spend significant time researching, consulting, and listening before bringing real stories to the screen. She emphasized that storytelling, when done responsibly, can amplify voices and spark conversations that might not otherwise reach wide audiences. Her tone was thoughtful, measured, and sincere. She did not rush. Sunny Hostin maintained steady eye contact, nodding slightly as Robbie spoke. There was no interruption, no attempt to steer the answer. The silence in the studio between sentences felt heavier than before, as if each word carried more weight. Robbie continued, explaining that she views her production work as a way to create space for perspectives that are often overlooked. She spoke about collaboration with writers, directors, and consultants who have direct experience with the issues portrayed. She made it clear that these stories are not chosen casually. And yet, the question lingered in the air, because Hostin's phrasing had introduced something more complex than intention. It introduced the idea of accountability beyond the film itself. When Robbie finished her thought, Hostin gently followed up. She asked whether she believes audiences expect more from actors and producers today than they did in the past. Whether viewers now look for signs that the people telling these stories are also engaging with the real issues in meaningful ways. Again, the tone was calm, but the focus had sharpened. Robbie paused a second time, shorter than the first but equally deliberate. She nodded slightly before answering, acknowledging that expectations have changed. She agreed that audiences are more aware, more informed, and more interested in the motivations behind the work they watch. Her voice remained steady, but her delivery had shifted from conversational to reflective. This was no longer a promotional exchange. It had become a discussion about ethics, influence, and perception. Around them, the other hosts remained quiet, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. The usual rhythm of panel discussion had slowed to a near standstill. The audience was completely silent. Robbie spoke about learning as she goes, about recognizing that storytelling is powerful and must be handled with care. She did not claim to have perfect answers. Instead, she emphasized the importance of listening and evolving. That humility gave the moment an authenticity that viewers could feel. Sunny Hostin thanked her for the answer, her expression thoughtful rather than confrontational. There was a brief silence before the conversation moved on, almost gently, toward lighter topics. Another host made a comment about an upcoming project. The audience responded with relieved laughter. The tension eased slightly, but the shift had already happened. The earlier part of the interview now felt distant, almost like a different segment. What had taken place was subtle but undeniable. A live conversation had stepped outside the boundaries of promotion and into something more meaningful, without anyone raising their voice or breaking decorum. For viewers watching at home, the moment stood out not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. It felt unscripted. It felt like two professionals navigating an important topic in real time, with no rehearsed lines to fall back on. Robbie regained her earlier rhythm as the segment continued, smiling and engaging with lighter questions. But her posture remained slightly more upright, her responses a bit more deliberate than before. The awareness of the exchange lingered in her demeanor. As the interview approached its conclusion, the hosts thanked her for joining them. The audience applauded warmly. The music played. Everything returned to the familiar structure of daytime television. Yet for those who had watched closely, this appearance was different from the dozens of others Robbie had done during the same press tour. Because one carefully worded question, asked calmly and respectfully on live television, had shifted the tone of the entire conversation. If you're watching The Truth Narrator, you know that sometimes the most powerful TV moments are not loud confrontations, but quiet exchanges that reveal more than either side expected. As the applause faded and the segment moved into its closing beats, the studio atmosphere did not immediately return to the light, celebratory tone that had defined the beginning of the interview. There was a subtle recalibration in the room, the kind that follows a moment of genuine reflection rather than entertainment. The host smiled, the music cue played, and the cameras prepared to transition. But those seated in the audience, and likely many watching at home, were still processing what they had just seen. It had not been dramatic. It had not been confrontational. Yet it carried a weight that lingered. Margot Robbie maintained her composure effortlessly. She thanked the hosts, waved to the audience, and exchanged brief pleasantries as the segment wrapped. Her professionalism never wavered. But her expression, just for a moment as the cameras widened, showed a thoughtful seriousness that had not been present earlier. Sunny Hostin, too, remained calm and measured. She did not appear triumphant or confrontational. Instead, her demeanor suggested that the exchange had been exactly what she intended it to be, a thoughtful conversation that connected art to responsibility without sensationalism. Behind the scenes, as the show cut to commercial, the energy on set shifted into the quiet movement that follows live television segments. Crew members adjusted positions. Audience members whispered among themselves. There was no buzz of chaos, but there was conversation. Moments like this are often discussed immediately after they happen, not because of conflict, but because they feel different from the norm. The audience had come expecting a typical celebrity interview. What they experienced was something more introspective. For Robbie, this kind of exchange requires a mental adjustment. Promotional interviews are usually fast-paced, friendly, and predictable. They rely on rhythm and repetition. But this segment had introduced an element of unpredictability that required deeper engagement. She had handled it gracefully, but it was clear that she had needed to think carefully in real time. The other hosts resumed their usual energy as the show continued, but their tone carried a trace of the seriousness that had just passed. There were no jokes referencing the moment, no attempt to highlight it. The show moved forward naturally, as live television always must. Yet the shift was visible in small ways. The pacing of conversation felt slightly more deliberate. The audience reactions were a bit more subdued for a few minutes before returning to their usual enthusiasm. It was as if everyone needed a brief pause to reset. For viewers at home, the moment was already being replayed mentally. Not because it was controversial, but because it was memorable. The kind of exchange that makes people lean in rather than glance away. What stood out was how respectfully it had unfolded. There had been no attempt to embarrass. No effort to create a headline. Just a well-placed question that required a thoughtful answer. As Robbie exited the stage area, still smiling, she appeared composed but reflective. Interviews like this often stay with guests longer than the more energetic, light-hearted ones. They prompt thought rather than relief. Sunny Hostin remained seated as the show transitioned, her expression calm. For her, this was part of the role she plays on the panel, guiding conversations into meaningful territory when the opportunity arises. She did not overextend the moment, nor did she underplay it. She allowed it to exist naturally within the flow of the program. That balance is what made the exchange feel authentic rather than staged. In the control room, producers likely noted the tone of the segment. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because something had gone unexpectedly right. The show had delivered a moment of genuine reflection without sacrificing professionalism or warmth. This is the unique nature of live television. Sometimes the most impactful segments are not the ones planned for maximum entertainment, but the ones where conversation takes an organic turn into deeper territory. As the broadcast continued, the moment gradually settled into memory. But it had already altered the perception of the interview. It was no longer just another stop on a press tour. It had become a conversation that viewers would remember for its sincerity. For Robbie, the immediate aftermath was likely quiet thoughtfulness rather than stress. She had navigated the question with care and honesty. There was no damage control needed, no clarification required. But there was an awareness that this interview had touched on something more substantial than most. And for the audience, both in the studio and at home, the feeling was the same. They had witnessed something unscripted and real, something that could only happen in the unedited space of live television. The show moved on, as it always does. But the moment stayed behind, lingering quietly in the atmosphere long after the cameras turned away. In the days that followed the broadcast, there were no sensational headlines, no viral clips framed as conflict, and no dramatic commentary dominating entertainment news. Yet for many viewers, the interview lingered in memory in a way that typical promotional appearances rarely do. Clips of the exchange circulated online, shared not for controversy, but for the thoughtful nature of the discussion. Viewers commented on how rare it felt to see a celebrity interview move beyond rehearsed anecdotes into something more reflective without becoming uncomfortable or hostile. The moment stood out precisely because it was calm, respectful, and unscripted. For Margot Robbie, the long-term impact of the interview was subtle but meaningful. It reinforced a perception that had already been forming around her career, that she was not only a performer, but someone willing to engage with the deeper implications of the stories she helps bring to the screen. Her answer did not rely on polished public relations language. It felt considered honest and aware. Audiences increasingly value authenticity, and this appearance quietly contributed to that image. It showed a side of Robbie that extended beyond charm and charisma. It showed her thinking in real time about responsibility, influence, and the role of storytelling in shaping public conversations. For Sunny Hostin, the exchange was consistent with the approach she is known for. She did not seek confrontation. She did not aim for a viral moment. Instead, she used the platform of live television to ask a question that connected entertainment to the broader world. It was a reminder of how talk shows can serve as spaces for meaningful dialogue rather than simple promotion. Culturally, the moment reflected a shift happening across media. Audiences are no longer satisfied with surface-level interviews when a celebrity's work intersects with real societal issues. They want to understand intention. They want to hear reflection. They want to see how public figures think when they are not reading from prepared notes. This interview became an example of how that expectation can be met without drama. It also highlighted the unique power of live television. In a media landscape filled with edited clips, rehearsed statements, and carefully managed public appearances, there is something compelling about watching a conversation unfold in real time. The pauses, the thoughtful expressions, the natural pacing, all of it contributes to a sense of authenticity that cannot be manufactured. The significance of the moment was not in what was said loudly, but in what was said carefully. Over time, this interview joined a collection of live TV moments that viewers recall not because they were explosive, but because they felt genuine. It demonstrated how a single question, asked at the right time and in the right way, can transform a routine segment into something memorable. For Robbie, it was another example of navigating the evolving expectations placed on actors and producers today. For Hostin, it was an example of how thoughtful journalism can exist within daytime television. And for viewers, it was a reminder that meaningful conversations can happen in the most ordinary settings when the opportunity is recognized. Why does this moment still matter? Because it captured a shift in how audiences engage with celebrity culture. People are more attentive, more curious, and more interested in substance. They notice when interviews move beyond promotion into reflection. They appreciate when public figures respond with sincerity rather than deflection. This was not a confrontation in the traditional sense. It was a quiet crossing of a line, from entertainment into thoughtful dialogue, broadcast live to millions. And that is what makes it worth remembering. If you value moments like this, where live television reveals something real beneath the surface, subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and pass this story along to others who appreciate meaningful conversations over manufactured drama.